I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I live and presenting from, the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. I also want to extend my acknowledgement to Indigenous peoples who have been impacted by the appropriation of land and exploitation of labor for the many commodities we rely on, like food. Food is a unique commodity. It has deep connections to culture and even national identity. Food is an essential need for our survival, and we need the variety of food for the range of its nutrients for our health. Since 2010, there has been a growth in research which points to the high consumption of a type of food that is associated with non-communicable diseases like heart diseases and diabetes. It is called ultra-processed food. The problem is not only that it is high in sugar and fat and salt, but it is also highly processed with industrial additives, preservatives, and produced in factories like instant noodles. How we eat and how food is produced has changed over time. What has caused the transformation of production and consumption, and how sustainable is the system which we rely our food from? The capital's global food system is centered on international trade of commodities, like Australian wheat, produced in large scale as monocrops. The impact of industrial agriculture, such as the use of chemicals, contribute to climate change, and the crop yield has been declining due to severe weather conditions. Sustainability efforts have focused on the environment, but I argue that we need to look at public health implications because it explains how transformation have impacted on society. From the production end, deforestation and the loss of biodiversity from the clearing of land from industrial agriculture increases the risk of outbreaks of zoonotic and vector-borne diseases, while chronic non-communicable diseases are responsible for 75% of non-pandemic related deaths around the world. Some are contributed from consumption, and structural inequalities can influence what food is consumed. These issues take time to develop, and this is why I look to the past for explanation of issues impacting sustainability. My research aim is to identify the missing links, which would help explain how public health implications have developed from the transformation of production and consumption over time across geographies, from the decision of actors of the capitalist global food system, governments, and corporations, using the perspective of planetary health equity, which is aligned to my values of social and environmental justice. The global food system has transformed with time, as with the capitalist system. Drawing from Friedman and McMichael's food regime periodization, the characteristic of the global food system changed from the colonial period in the first food regime, followed by the Cold War in the second food regime, and now the third, or the corporate food regime in the neoliberal era. Food regime is useful to explain why there are differences in the character of the global food system across the different periods, and I have adopted it for my 5 empirical chapters. However, I needed a framework which helps me identify how and what had transformed that had contributed specifically to public health implications. This is why I developed two conceptual frameworks for this research. The first, the Q, focuses on the interconnected dimensions of the global food system, where each of the aspects help us understand the different transformations. History provides some explanation of how present issues have developed from the past. Transformation across geographies from international trade of food can be shaped by geopolitical and economy, while large-scale production of monocrops transform the environment and affects consumption. Lastly, transformation of commodity such as wheat to ultra-processed food highlights how food has commercially transformed to cater for social changes. For example, instant noodles, cheap, quick to prepare, and convenient with long shelf life, which suits people with busy lifestyle who are time and resource poor. My second conceptual framework are the levers that influence the transformation of consumption. I call them the 4 A's, and they're drawn from the clauses of right to adequate food. What influences consumers' decision? The availability of food is determined by production, while the accessibility is affected by distribution. Any issues impacting these two levers affect the third, affordability. Government subsidies or corporate hedging on commodity stock market can also influence food prices, while the acceptability of food is linked to taste, religion, culture, and identity. And these can be manufactured, like the flavors of the sachets of instant noodles, which can be adapted to the palates of the target market. The many interconnections and complexities relating to food is one of the reasons why I use case study as my methodology. It enables me to narrow down on wheat, a staple grain, and focuses on the specific issues arising from the production of the commodity and the consumption in the form of instant noodles and ultra processed food, often consumed as meal replacement, not as snack. Wheat is Australia's largest plant-based agricultural export, and Australia is one of the 6 major wheat exporting countries in the world. To give you an idea, my calculation on the value of wheat traded in the international market from these 6 countries alone equates to 70%. Indonesia, on the other hand, is one of the biggest importer of Australian wheat, mainly used for production and consumption of instant noodles. Indonesians have an insatiable appetite for instant noodles. According to the World Instant Noodle Association, Indonesia ranks second in the world, after China and Hong Kong, on the serving demands of instant noodles. However, my calculation shows that Indonesia is the largest consumer of instant noodles per capita. I also drew on a second methodology, Levi Strauss bricolage, which can be described as doing what you can with what you have. It is essentially about being resourceful in utilizing what is available in hand, combining mixed methods, as well as a range of information from both ray and scholarly literature, as well as archival material to piece together an explanation. I found this to be particularly useful for this research because there are many information that are not available or accessible. There are a logic to how my empirical chapters contribute to the overall research. 2 historical chapters which explains the transformation. Chapter 4 on production using the case study on Australian wheat and Chapter 5 on the consumption of instant noodles. Then it leads to 3 chapters focusing on sustainability issues in the present time. Chapter 6 on Australian wheat production, Chapter 7 on consumption of instant noodles. Lastly, Chapter 8 on international trade. My first empirical chapter explains that Australia became a major wheat exporting country as a result of colonization. Wheat was brought to Australia from Britain on the first fleet in 1788 for the colony to be self-sufficient. It is grown on unceded land. I drew from academic literature to explain that large-scale production of wheat impacted Indigenous Australians in 3 ways: the loss of food sources from the appropriation of land, the rationing of food to only flour, sugar, and tea, and the exploitation of labor. Food and nutritional insecurity, as well as social inequalities, are vulnerabilities as a consequence of colonialism, which later manifests into health implications. While I cannot find the impact of Australian wheat export to Indonesia during the first food regime, I came across something really interesting. Labels of flour bags from the archival collection of the State Library of New South Wales. These labels are dated around the end of World War I and the start of World War II. From my analysis, I found two insights. More labels were heading to Medan, the capital of North Sumatra and other destination in Dutch East Indies. And almost all labels had Chinese characters, which prompted me to question why was Medan a market for wheat flour? It turns out that the Dutch colonial authorities had established plantations to produce tobacco and later palm oil to be exported to Europe. This attracted laborers from many places to come and work there. The population in Medan was diverse, and Chinese make up over one third at the time, and possibly the imported wheat flour was used to make noodles. Wheat cannot be cultivated optimally in the tropical climate of Indonesia. Therefore, it is rather peculiar how the nation became so hooked on instant noodles. It turns out that the transformation of consumption is linked to foreign interference during the Cold War, which Chapter 5 is situated in, the Second Food Regime. Indonesia was a target for US, utilizing its agricultural surplus under Public Law PL 480 as a way to curb communism, because Indonesia had the largest communist party outside of Russia and China at the time. Many of the members were farmers and peasants. I drew insights from the archival export data from US to Indonesia, which shows first the decline in rice export, adding to the state of food insecurity during the turmoil period leading up to the coup d'etat in 1965. It followed with several years of mass killings of members and allies of Indonesia's Communist Party, which led to the country's worst massacre in history. Then the growth of wheat flour exports from 1969, when instant noodle companies started to open in Indonesia. It was followed with a spike in wheat grain exports in 1972, which coincided with the opening of Bogasari, the world's largest flour mill in Jakarta, which gave rise to the production and consumption of instant noodles. Chapter 6 and 7 have a lot of similarities. Both question sustainable issues in the current third food regime. Both use semi-structured interviews with the stakeholders of the industry. Chapter 6 on Australian wheat production and Chapter 7 on Indonesian instant noodles consumption. Both findings had similarities as well, as the dependency on labor and market and the selling off of small family farms to corporations, highlighting the characteristic of the neoliberal era. The economic dependencies to export wheat for Australia and palm oil for Indonesia are also evident. But what is showing up as a sustainability issue is that these major commodities producing industries have import dependencies. Australia needs to import agricultural products for its farm operations, like pesticides and fertilizers, while Indonesia depends on wheat import for instant noodles, which many of the laborers working in cash crop plantations rely on. This is because of the lack of land available to grow local food, as well as the lack of farmers who have opted out to work as farm laborers because they are not able to compete with cheap imported food. The last empirical chapter, I found that countries prioritize trade in an international summit on sustainable food system, which had been called for in light of world crisis. I drew data from the speeches of the representatives from major wheat importing and exporting countries. Their speeches used the word sustainable as a positive adjective, just like these two examples, but sustainability was not defined. The issue with prioritizing international trade is that large-scale production of monocrops will continue, as will mass consumption of ultra-processed food, which are made from these commodities. From the findings of the 5 empirical chapters, I developed 2 concepts which explain issues of the capitalist global food system. First, manufactured vulnerabilities, which is the weakened condition that is optimal to enable the capitalist actors to continue to exploit and appropriate. It is evident in Chapter 4 and 5, where colonialism and US imperialism have manufactured vulnerabilities in form of food insecurities, from establishing plantation for productions of commodities or from the export of surplus agricultural products. These vulnerabilities continue to present at the present time in Chapter 6 and 7 in the form of dependencies and the continued need to grow production and consumption. This leads to the need of more land and labor. This cycle of problems can be understood from the second concept, gastrocapitalism. Gastrocapitalism explains how the capitalist actors in their control of food also have the power over humans, humans as labor and market, labor for production and market for consumption, with food at the center of it because it is an essential need. The totality of control of the capitalist system over food and humans is achieved by manufactured vulnerabilities, which help explain how public health implications are manifested. This is why I conclude that the capitalist global food system is a determinant of health. The actors of capitalism, governments and corporations, have prioritized geopolitical, economic, and commercial interests over the health of planet and people.